So welcome to Ways of Working. This is our canvas to explore different ways of working together, and for us to see what's in the art of the possible. And who knows, we might learn something new here today. So with me is a very special guest, Trevor, who I met back in 2018, where we had a little working group where we were exploring what we could do and how we could work together in different ways. And then I reconnected with Trevor last year when I saw his name in the acknowledgement for a book that I was really enjoying at the time, which was the Fractal Organization. And so we reconnected, and then from there, Trevor's taught me a lot actually about history, about moral modalities and how we behave with each other. And so I'm going to hand over to you, Trevor.
I actually realized in January it was my 51st anniversary of being in what we now call digital. I mean, when I went into it, it was the year before the first microprocessor was invented, and about 4 or 5 years before the first desktop PC started to show up. So, it was COBOL programming and rooms full of air-conditioned equipment. And it's been an incredibly interesting, non-linear 51 years. And I've done all sorts of interesting stuff. When I got to the point in the mid-90s where I was reasonably comfortably off and, I wasn't sort of driven by, oh my God, I've got 3 kids to raise and a wife to look after, and some of these things I have to do, I just got to do because you've got to keep the roof over your head. It gave me the chance to kind of reflect about all the different projects I've done. I mean, I've done sort of VC funded stuff in Silicon Valley. I'd done work with Finnish companies doing weird stuff for the Russians behind when it was the Soviet Union, and all sorts of weird, sort of strange projects. Because whenever anything interesting came up, I'd go, "Wow, that sounds interesting." So off I would go. In the mid-90s, as I started to look back and think, I've got a bit of money in the bank and I've got a bit of time to reflect. And this is about 1992, 1993. I started to think, if I'm honest with myself and look back over that time and all these different kind of organizations, there's something about the first few minutes of an engagement where you could tell, if you were honest, whether it was going to be a mess and a disaster, possibly a lucrative one, because sometimes if it's a mess, and particularly if you're getting paid by the hour, you make more money out of it. If it's a mess than if it isn't, which is kind of embarrassing. And I felt a bit embarrassed about that. I thought, well, there's something about the organizational side of things. And because I was on so-called bleeding edge technology, like desktop computing when it was new and all sorts of stuff like that, people always thought that failures were caused by the fact you're on the leading edge of technology. I don't know. What was wrong was organizational stuff. The social dynamics between the people, the psychology of the people, why they were doing what they were doing, even when they weren't being very honest about it. Who knows about that stuff? I mean, somebody must. And that was what prompted me to track down Stafford Beer, because I had a book sitting on my bookshelf since about 1980 called Platform for Change, and I'd forgotten about it. And I pulled it down and went, whoa, this is really, really interesting stuff. Is this guy even still alive? Because back in those days, it wasn't that easy. I'd never set eyes on a picture of the guy because that wasn't a thing. I didn't know whether he was alive or dead. So I wrote to his publishers, Wiley's, and they lost it. And it took about a year before finally we got into touch with each other. And he would write letters with a beautiful fountain pen and a beautiful hand. He didn't like email because he wanted to be able to express himself by sketches and little notes and with a fountain pen and with a real kind of flow. It was very artistic. And so we kind of got to know each other, finally met in 1984. And the amount of stuff I learned, I was just astonished. Um, and then I started to apply it in 1996 and got staggering results and couldn't understand why everybody didn't know about this or why they didn't teach this stuff. Well, actually at school, let alone when you're doing an MBA or something.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, what is going on here? Why doesn't everybody know about this and why isn't it being applied anywhere? And that was the beginning of trying to figure that out and also how to get around the barriers to make sure you could do work that was always going to be successful
Yeah.
and wasn't kind of like just randomly going to fail.
Yeah.
So that's really what I love. I love solving problems and
Nice.
helping other people to solve problems. And it seems weird that there's all this knowledge, mostly in the social and psychological dimension, that most of us are just not using. We're acting as though it doesn't exist. And that's like, hey, it does.
Nice. I'd love to go into some of the key learnings that you had through that fountain pen letter exchange with Stafford Beer. But before we go there, I'm going to invite you to do a very short somatic practice because, if we're going to really change the paradigm, we have to do it from a different state. And I strongly believe that it's the embodied state that leaders need to take on actually, and to come back to the body. And so I'm going to invite you to first place your hands together and just gently
Yeah,
rub. Or it could be here. I'm just trying to not
yeah,
knock
yeah,
my
yeah, yeah,
microphone.
yeah.
Can be just in very slowly. Just feel how your hands feel as you rub them against each other, and as you do that, place your feet on the floor so that you can feel the bottom of your feet either against your shoes or against the floor. Feel that groundedness. Press into your toes. And as you do that, feel the crown of your head reaching up. And just look around the room that you're in. So notice around the room, notice what you can see as you look around, as you orient
It's a
yourself to
terrible
your
mess.
surroundings. Humor, that's another great way of getting into the body and out of our heads. So let's crack on. I'd love to hear some of the learnings that you had through this exchange that you had with Stafford Beer, this fountain pen exchange. What were some of the key takeaways that then you've carried on with you into your successes with organizations?
He, I mean, he was a very, very interesting character. Um, and he spent 50% when the weather wasn't too cold. He actually, when I met him in 1994, he was living in a cottage in a disused quarry in the middle of Wales, out in the countryside, that didn't even have running water. It was like a kind of almost a kind of meditation place. And he had a huge long beard. And it was like very guru-like figure. And it was like, who is this guy? And then when I looked into his background, it turned out that he he had actually been a captain of industry, a traditional English captain of industry, literally, with smoking the big fat cigar and the three-piece suit and driving a Rolls Royce. I mean, really driving a Rolls Royce, living in a mansion in Surrey, member of the Athenaeum Club, like the premier gentleman's club, and all this kind of stuff. And then he'd gone through this like bizarre kind of transition, which actually was to do with the fact he got mixed up with trying to run the government in Chile for Professor Salvador Allende, who
Right.
was
Wow.
the first democratically elected Marxist leader, who who appointed some 25-year-old kid called Fernando Flores as his economics guy, and he wrote to Stafford Beer saying, "Come and help us to build a socialist economy that works for the people." And you go, well, I suppose if you're a management consultant and someone says, "Hey, come and do that," what you going to do? And of course, ultimately, it was a catastrophic disaster because it turned out that Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger had decided they were going to kill Salvador Allende's regime almost the moment he was elected, and the CIA went at it, and corporate America went to take it down, and in the end they did. So it was taken down in the uh, Pinochet's coup on September the 11th, 1973. And Stafford Beer happened to be in London at the time. Otherwise, God knows what would have happened because a lot of people involved in that just vanished, disappeared, and were never seen again. It was really, really nasty. And then he found the whole thing very devastating. It changed his life. He kind of gave everything away in a rather grandiose gesture and went and
Yeah.
lived in this funny little cottage after that. And then the other 50% of his time, he was living in Toronto with a woman called Alana Leonard, who's still alive. And she'd been one of his PhD students, and she kind of rescued him from this sense of total catastrophe that the whole of his life was ruined. So it's quite romantic in a way that this guy went to sort of basically give up on everything and become a kind of renouncing tantric yogi.
Yeah.
And she kind of pulled him out of that and got him back on his feet. He did more work in places like Manchester Business School and visiting professor all over the place, which is the kind of stuff he was doing when I met him in 1994.
Is
So,
that when he came up with the VSM model, when he
no,
was
he'd
in?
come up with
Okay.
the viable system model, the laws of viability. He started that, I would say he started thinking about it in the 1960s, and he got it figured out in the 1970s and started to write about it. But by the time I met him, he was much more interested in something called team integration, which
Hmm.
is a method of kind of organizing managerial decision making. And he published a book about that in 1994, just literally as I met him. That book came out, and he's been working for about 10 years by then. So for him, I was fascinated by the viable system model because I thought that when Windows 95 came out, it was the first properly networked version of Microsoft Windows. They would become, hey, you can run local area networks with Windows machines and they don't crash all the time.
Right.
What could we do with that? And I
Hmm.
thought that there would be this huge demand for people to create new forms of organization that only existed through the network and didn't have to be embodied in any physical location anymore. And I thought that was going to be a killer app for Windows 95. So that's what I was trying to work on. And I thought the viable system model was the way to do it and started writing software for that. And with a vision of a VC funded thing, because I'd done VC funded things in Silicon Valley earlier.
Hmm.
But what I found was that Stafford Beer and the community around him had absolutely no idea what I was talking about because nobody in England really understood Silicon Valley VC culture at all. It just did not exist. So I was banging my head against a brick wall.
Right. And then, so when you met him, he was looking more at teams and how they were behaving together, I guess.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about that was it was it was a very complex thing built around the geometry of the icosahedron, which required you to bring together a group of 30 people for a series of interactions that would take at least 3 days. I just thought, well, it's really over engineered. How are you going to get anybody to agree to even fund that.
Mm.
And because of the way the geometry worked, it had to be 30 people. And I just thought that's kind of over engineered and nobody's ever going to want to do that.
Mm.
Somewhat ironically, one of his students called Fedmund Malik went and set up a management consultancy in Switzerland at St. Gallen using that. That was the particular his focus. And he became a multimillionaire because he founded the most successful management consultancy in the German speaking world.
Mm.
Um, but outside the German speaking world, the method didn't really get traction anywhere else, which is kind of culturally interesting.
Mm.
So I'm still thinking maybe he's really used this viable systems approach properly and successfully. And he was just thinking that's just like, oh, I did it like 20 years ago. I'm not interested. I'm doing
Right.
this other thing, which I didn't think was frankly very interesting.
Right.
Too
Okay.
complicated, too kind of grandiose and old school, quite old school, I thought,
Yeah.
in a certain way.
And I guess for people listening who maybe haven't come across the viable system model, is there a quick intro that you have for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the basic, um, I do teach this stuff, as you know, in a sort of 1 day crash course
Yeah,
to
absolutely.
get people's feet on the starting line. And to sum it up, it's basically saying that any organization that wants to be viable in its environment, and it's particularly about the nature of an organization in its environment, has to have 5 functions that are working together in balance. And that you have to keep these things in balance, otherwise, the organization will become unstable and it will not continue to engage successfully in the environment it's in. Um, and those functions, I mean, it's sort of embarrassingly simple and obvious, and yet people seem to just kind of miss it. So what it says is that there is think about, I always describe it in terms of something like a coffee chain, you know, one of those international coffee chains like Starbucks or something. Like if you think about a branch of Starbucks in a high street, um, for it to be viable at that level, it has to make people aware that it's there, and what, and if they've got an expectation, they know what it does. And of course that is done by the marketing of the logo, mostly that logo is known all over the planet. Um, but when you walk in, you can't get anything unless there is operational the operational functions are there. And the operational functions are the things that deliver the aspect of the organization that the customers care about. So when they walk in, there has to be somebody behind the counter on a clean floor and tables and um, a supply of coffee beans and tea and milk, different kinds of milk, all that kind of stuff has to be there. That's all operational stuff, making sure that all that stuff is there. That he calls system one, like the stuff that you care about because it's delivering the service to the customers
Hmm.
out into the environment. If you think about the customers as being the environment you're serving, operational stuff has to be there. Otherwise, there's no point. Nobody cares about what you're doing. That for that operational stuff to work properly, it has to work on a series of rhythms and cycles. Like there's probably a weekly delivery of coffee beans or something. Um,
Yeah.
you have to make sure you order the right amount that will get you through until the next delivery comes. So there are these, and you also have to organize to make sure that the staff turn up at the right time and that there aren't 2 people turning up on one shift and not on another.
Mm.
This is the coordination function. It's about how do you coordinate between these operational functions so they don't trip up or you get leads and lags and you run out of oat milk in the middle of the day or your fridge is not working or something.
Yeah.
And that's you call that system two, coordination. And then he said, well, for those operations to work, the people doing those operations they're focused on delivering what they do. And they've got some kind of a contract that you call a resource bargain that says that when I turn up for my shift between the hours of X and Y, because there's a resource bargain in place that says in agreement for me coming along and not going off and doing something else with my time, you're going to give me the resources I care about to keep a roof over my head and be able to look after the people I love. Um, and that's why you turn up, if you like. I mean, you might love being behind the counter, but if there isn't that resource bargain in place and a contract and so on, why is anybody going to bother to turn up to for? Because the operational people are there contributing to your grander purpose.
Yeah.
From their point of view, this might be just the job that they've got, and there isn't anything else they could do. They don't care about how all the supplies are turning up and what have you. They do their bit.
Yeah.
So there has to be a level of equal control. I've got cohesion
Cohesion.
that says, well, I'm up here looking down on all this stuff, and I can create this cohesive structure so that all of these things are all don't have to know the bigger picture. But if I didn't know the bigger picture, none of this stuff would work, and that's a cohesion level, which we call system 3, and it makes sure the operations are given the resource they need to do what they need to do within that bigger purpose. And it also oversees that the coordination takes place, the
Yeah.
system 2 stuff. And then you could have a wonderful thing that runs doing all that stuff. Obviously, the environment you're in is evolving all the time. So if you imagine Starbucks when it first launched, I I don't know the dates, but I don't think anybody had thought of the idea of oat milk, you know,
Mm.
non-dairy types of different non-dairy types of milk. And if Starbucks had ignored the fact that people were beginning to demand, I don't want dairy products, I want oat milk, I want almond milk, whatever. If they'd ignored that, they would have lost their connection with their environment, and because people will go somewhere else.
Yeah.
And in order to evolve your organization to keep up with the fact that the environment is changing, like, oh, there's a demand for something we didn't know about, you have to have a system of intelligence to look outside what you're doing now and into the future to make sure you're going to be able to evolve to keep up with this evolutionary process that's unfolding. And you call that system 4,
Mm.
intelligence. That's 4 systems. It's like, well, it's really simple, but the system, and then he said, well, the final element that holds the whole thing together is that there has to be some purpose for this enterprise. It has to have some overarching purpose. It must have policies. It must have a value system that separates it from the rest of the universe. Like what makes Starbucks different to Costa Coffee or Apple computers or something. It's like a membrane around it that says this is the difference between being in here and working for Starbucks and being working for someone else. And the people that manage that are doing the policy work and the ethos systems and all that kind of stuff that says this is who we are, this is our purpose in the universe, this is why anybody cares about coming to our shop. And without that, in the end, you have nothing because you're just going to disappear because you haven't got an identity. So that's system 5, the identity function. And that's about it. But then the thing that makes it quite subtle is that the world is made up. So you can take that viable system idea and you
Mm.
can say, hey, that works for a cell in my
Yeah.
fingertip.
Yeah.
It works for how my heart is beating in my chest.
Yeah.
So it works at different levels of scale, what we call recursion.
Yeah.
So you don't need another a sixth system. But this is recursive. So every viable system is nested inside another viable system at another level, inside another one at another
Yeah.
level. in many different dimensions that makes it actually surprisingly subtle and dynamic and much more of an evolutionary and a dynamic way of thinking about organization than the way that most economics works. Most economists thinking of it, it was almost like a kind of Newtonian 19th century machine in a world where we've got relativistic and quantum mechanics, all sorts of
Yeah.
stuff. It's kind of most ways of thinking about this stuff are bafflingly old school. They're like, they haven't really changed since the 19th century, actually.
It's a
And I
surprise that
like this stuff because it feels really organic and evolutionary and dynamic. And I find that you can learn to just see this stuff very clearly. And then you can help people in their organizations because you can see how they've got kind of stuck at a certain point and what you need to do to help them to get out of that trap. So it's very, very practical. It's not, I don't see it as being an academic thing. I think part of the reason it's not better known is it got kind of hijacked by academia.
It's
Does that make
surprising that
sense?
you yeah, absolutely, and it's surprising that you still have organizations that are so siloed, versus thinking in systems,
Oh,
which is,
absolutely.
what we're describing here, especially as the world becomes more complex or as our environments are changing at ever more rapid paces. Organizations that are perhaps more siloed need to maybe start to adopt some of these more resilient models where you end up with a lattice work of these viable systems that
Yeah,
cooperate to have the desired outcome, for the entire organization. But I guess one of the challenges that organizations face is if they've been historically set up with very firm silos. You've obviously got people that are also entrenched in those silos and very
yeah,
embedded in
absolutely.
them and operating in certain modes, and changing that is actually part of the challenge, and the fear of letting go and to dive into a less known system perhaps is what I think holds people back. And I think your personal evolution on the viable systems was then into kind of moral modalities. I guess we're not going
That's
to have
right.
time to dive into that fully, but maybe a kind of a teaser there for
Yeah,
our
absolutely.
audience.
So basically, one of the things was that I got the first opportunity to take my expertise in what we now call digital, but back then we called it IT or ICT. I got an opportunity to use viable systems approach on a massively complex project in 1996, and where I got invited to head up a technical team to completely transform the IT for a supermarket chain that was turning over about £2 billion a year just in the UK. And their head office was in complete disarray because they had 24 separate IT systems running on about four different hardware platforms, from mini computers to desktop computers to great green screen stuff. And it was, 24 separate systems, one for each of the departments for, wines and spirits or fresh produce or all the, and they didn't communicate with each other. And the network cabling in the HQ in Middlesex was so catastrophic that people would fall over one coax cable somewhere, and the whole building would just go down, and all the network was gone. It was really in chaos. And by a series of an interim manager who was trying to turn the thing round, invited me to form a tech team. I thought this is great because they're in real trouble. This is a chance for us to really go for this and use this VSM approach. And I handpicked four techies that I knew them because we were in sub contract programs together on different projects. And in fact, one of them, even my apprentice before I told him to form his own business. And I pulled the little team together, um, and we were able. I mean, literally, we had five techies. The interim manager understood what we were doing, otherwise it would have been impossible. And he was the sort of guy that could present to a board and manage the budgets and hide the radicalness of the project from the board, the director. They just thought this was an ordinary IT project. They knew nothing about us.
This
Not
was your
realizing
skunk works team, is
it
this
was,
is this
it really was. It was like we were working from home, but nobody did that in 1996. We didn't even have an office. We had no tools for doing that apart from sending emails and talking on the phone because it didn't exist. And yet we got the project benchmark 2 years in by our information research lecturer at a university. I've forgotten the name of which one it was. Um, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing because he'd been commissioned to look at best practice in software engineering. And he just couldn't believe what we were doing. And I said, "Can you give us some evidence? But can you benchmark this against other retail IT transformations that were going on at the time?" It was all about client server computing. Relational databases were a new thing, and that's really the milieu. Client server was coming up, business process range, all that kind of stuff. And he actually proves that what we'd done in 2 years with 5 staff, we'd outperformed an implementation of a pre-existing SAP software package that had taken 74 people 5 years so far, and they hadn't made as much progress as we'd made in 2 years with 5 people. So we were like, we finished the project a year later and we built this future-proof client server platform, complete transformation, without ever disrupting the business at all. There was never a day when the business wasn't working as normal 5 days a week during business hours. And it was a huge transformation. And I wrote a paper about it, an academic paper about how we did it. Um, and then I went to conferences to present it, to sell this to other corporations like, Tesco's and Marks and Spencer's, and because and they all just got up, walked out of the room, wouldn't talk to me.
too good to be
And I'm
true?
thinking, oh my God, how am I going to make a living?
Yeah.
And because I was a bit naive, I just had not grasped the political horror. Because what I was offering to say, what I said to people was, look, if you've got a team of 100 programmers, we could come in, we'll do a study, identify which of your handful of programmers are really doing the work. Like,
Yeah.
we'll find you the 5 people who are really doing the work, teach them how to do it this way, and you can get rid of all the other ones, frankly, and you will operate 10 times faster and get the thing delivered. But the
Right.
problem is, if you've got a career as a guy that's got a huge budget to run an IT department with 100 staff in it, you just don't want to know about that because it's the
Mm.
end of your career. What's he going to do? So of course they all
Right.
just walked out.
Right.
So so I realised that one of the reasons why nobody was applying this was because of the terror of a new world in which problems are being solved so rapidly that you couldn't have a stable career running an IT department with 100 staff.
Yeah.
Uh,
It reminds
uh,
me of the early days of Agile, 'cause we were doing some early Agile implementations at Sainsbury's, and it was this like there was this real political battle almost. It's like,
yeah,
can they deliver on time in 3 months what we're saying is gonna take, a couple of years to do, but we need to get it out to market. So it was like
well, that's right. So
absolute, yeah,
basically, what
echoes of
we'd
that.
done, we were using this variable system approach. And to be honest, what I discovered was that although the guys that were in my team absolutely loved what we were doing, they also didn't really understand how I was making it work because because to me it was all obvious.
Yeah.
And they didn't care. All they could care was they loved working on the project. They got paid comfortably the normal, contract rates, but they enjoyed the work so much more because they knew they were delivering instead of going round and round in circles and a bit before the project expired, and they went to the next contract, which would also fail. So they loved it, but they didn't really understand it either. So they didn't really get it. So I thought this stuff was really obvious, and then I was kind of horrified to realise oh my God, nobody else understands what the hell I'm doing. And I found out that I couldn't get any traction outside of small startups that didn't have very much money, who didn't know that what we were doing was impossible. It all looked completely obvious to them because they didn't know enough to know that it wasn't.
Yeah.
And
So what were
so
you
I developed.
seeing? What were you seeing that was so obvious to you and missing, from the general
Well,
perspective?
again, I developed this for years. I was racking my brains about things like this because I'd also recognised studying the community around Stafford Beer, um, with the work that he had done, he'd written up in his books, that many of the interactions that he called cybernetic interventions failed really badly. And you think about it, he had attempted to intervene in Chile, ended up with a catastrophe, and a lot of people died and disappeared and had all sorts of traumatic. Good luck to him. He actually rescued many people from disaster and managed to get them out of Chile so they could form safe careers in England. And good luck to him for doing that.
Yeah.
But I don't think he had really understood the social dynamics that, that he walked into a hornet's nest because he actually didn't realize he was in the middle of the Cold War. So the Americans perceived him to be some kind of weird commie bastard Soviet agent in their
Right.
backyard.
Yeah.
So that's why they wanted to stamp the thing out. And he wasn't. Wasn't what he was about at all. But he was kind of politically naive and didn't realize how dangerous what he was doing was, because he was politically naive. And I think he was. He was a really nice guy,
Mm.
but he came from a kind of upper middle class English, almost Edwardian background. Hence the Athenaeum Club membership and the cigars and everything else. And
Right.
he sort of become this kind of perceived to be some kind of weird socialist firebrand. And he never, it was like he couldn't really join the two up. I don't think, so I developed this kind of five-dimensional moral philosophy approach to study the social tripwires and the dynamics that damage these attempts to transform organizations so that I could teach people about that so they would not actually suffer from those problems.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah.
So that, and most of the community around Stafford Beer don't really know anything about that. Although the guy that did our benchmark in 1998, a guy called Peter Kowalik, he is now the president of the Cybernetics Society.
Yeah.
So at last year's annual general meeting, he asked me to do the keynote speech to present my viable systems model because he thought it was such an important contribution to management studies.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But it's still not very well known. It's not very well understood, to be honest.
So tell me more about your application of moral modalities in this viable systems world. What's the short version for our listeners? And obviously, hopefully that's going to tempt them to find out a lot more because there's such a great depth to this work. But it's like one of those. It's like when you look at Vedanta or you look at Ayurveda, you can go at a shallow range and still get a lot, or you can keep on diving deeper into this. And I feel like this is one of those subjects.
Yeah, and I, yeah, it is. You're absolutely right about that because I think the struggle that Stafford Beer had, and I consider him to be probably as brilliant a figure of the 20th century as people like Alan Turing. And of course, Alan Turing was unknown until after the 30-year secrecy thing about the extraordinary things that had been done at Bletchley Park. They were completely unknown for 30 years, and nobody's talked about them for 30 years. And it was only after that 30 years expired that the story started to come out. And also, I think partly the reason why people care about Alan Turing is became because he kind of became a kind of gay icon. which I don't think he ever would have perceived himself to be. But that's part of why his story re-emerged after that secrecy was lifted. And also, he did fantastic work. Um,
Mm.
but he was part of the community of the cyberneticians. They had a thing called the Ratio Club where they used to meet for dinner. And the cybernetics people in Britain were psychiatrists and all sorts of people like that. And they used to meet up with Alan Turing over dinner in their different laboratories and tell each other about their work. And that was a kind of like an underground thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so basically, um, what I realized is that the five functions in the viable system model, with its kind of levels of recursion, actually correspond to five different psychological framings of how human beings operate. And I think I woke up one morning, I dreamt it in about 2014. I suddenly went, oh God, this is actually a really powerful framework for understanding what makes us human, what makes us tick. And it basically says that there are these five modalities of conduct. I mean, my first degree was in theology and philosophy, so I got a bit of a background in philosophy, but I always thought that moral philosophy in particular, 18th century Enlightenment thinking, was really feeble because
Mm.
it didn't explain what human beings are really like. I mean, human beings don't go around thinking about categorical imperatives when they're acting in the world. It's like, man, Immanuel Kant, like, get a life. What are you talking about? This is not what people are like at all. Why do you think people are like that? Because they aren't. And I thought, well, in real life, um, I said there are these different modalities. They do operate at different levels. They operate from the sort of personal sphere of activity into our kind of work life and also into the public sphere of public policy decision making and stuff like that. Um, but they're really quite simple. The fundamental one is what I call unconditional care, which is like people caring for each other because that's what people do. You know, you think about what it means to be a human being. Um, Human beings, when they're born, are the most hopelessly helpless
Mm.
mammals on the planet. I mean, like they're absolutely, they're lying. They go, you know. I mean, if you're an antelope and when you're born, if you're not running as far to keep up with your herd within 10 minutes of being born, you are dead.
Mm.
So the speed at which an antelope gets to the point where it's viable as a member of that herd is like, yeah, 10 minutes later or else.
Mm.
The jackals will get you or whatever. You've got 10 minutes, get on with it. Um, so human beings are sort of extraordinary in being so unbelievably helpless um, when they're born. And they are hypersocial beings. They are the most dependent on their social group around them. And they continue to be dependent on that social group kind of like forever. But in terms of even growing up, well, come on, guys, let's all admit it. Certainly in a modern developed society, nobody's grown up until they're in their 20s, if ever, because
Yeah.
actually in modern life, you can stay kind of quite infantile for a very long time because you're not at risk. You think about up until industrialization, if you think about Richard II when he was the king, he was confronting the peasants' revolt of Wat Tyler in Billingsgate in London, sitting on a horse when he was 14 years old.
Mm.
And a lot of those guys had to start when they were 14 years old. They were warriors at the age of 14 or 15. And if they weren't, they weren't going to survive. And it would be most of them were dead in their 30s, particularly women because of dying in childbirth. So everything had to be really kind of, you had to grow up really fast and so on, but we don't have to do that because we've got teenagers and adolescents and stuff like that, which is a kind of luxury that didn't used to exist. So basically, that unconditional care thing says we do an enormous amount for each other just because that's what human beings do.
Yeah.
And it particularly is women's work, which is, it's the women, it's the mothers that have all, and the grandmothers that have always been the absolute foundation of human culture. They're the ones bringing the kids up and telling the stories about what it is to be a human, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And also the ones doing things like making all the clothes and the textiles and doing the cooking and a lot of technology is women's work.
Yeah.
Or it was before the factories were invented. Most textiles were manufactured by women sitting around making clothes and spinning and sewing in between looking after the kids and cooking the food. So a lot of technology is female,
Mm.
but it's been kind of neglected because people don't think of it because they think of men inventing things, all this kind of stuff, which is a kind of weird fantasy that. So you've got that unconditional care modality, which corresponds to that system one. Like if you don't get that right, all the things don't. Everything else is off. There's nothing else. There is no human life without that,
Yeah.
and that's the stuff that I think people like Elon Musk and Donald Trump and these weird kind of autistic weirdos that do things like they don't really understand that at all, as far as I can make out. They just don't get it. Just don't seem to understand it at all. I think it's anyway. So that's system one,
Yeah,
unconditional
absolutely.
care, which is people doing stuff because if you don't do that, all bets are off, and nobody becomes a sane adult. Even
Yeah.
they just become deeply unbalanced, so they don't survive.
Yeah.
So that's system one. It's the equivalent of uh, the foundation of everything else, like
The operations, yeah.
the operational equipment. And it's also what kicks in emergencies. So I didn't mention that, but there's this idea in the viable system model of what stuff are called algedonic signals, which is like, what do you do in an emergency? How do you kick in to emergency mode? And you can't follow the normal accountability. You've got to respond to emergencies. So that's the unconditional care aspect. There's the what I call the guardianship modality, is the role of saying who we are, what's our value system.
Mm.
So in traditional societies, these things are gendered. They don't have to be, but they are. That unconditional care is motherly love stuff
Yeah.
traditionally, and they don't have to be gendered because they're functions. But traditionally, they used to be very gendered, and we're sort of working our way out of that. The guardianship modality that says this is who we are. This is who we are as a community, as family, or whatever, is that boundary that says, hey, if you don't stand inside this value system,
Yeah.
you can't be a member of this community. It's traditionally the father's role of clicking the kids around the ear and saying, "Oh, you don't do that in this family. You do not do that. Do not do that, or you cannot be a member of this community."
Mm.
And again, it works at lots of different levels. So that's what I call guardianship. It corresponds to the System 5 value, policy, ethos
Yeah.
aspect of thing. And then there is the exchange modality, which is the equivalent of System 2 coordination, which is like we don't wield power over each other, but we've got some things that you might like, and you've got some things that we might like. Let's do
Mm-hmm.
some deals, and let's operate without trying to wield power over each other, but let's do negotiating. It's kind of like market economics and free markets and stuff
So
like that.
transactions.
It's about transactions, mostly between strangers. Where what do you do when you need a supply chain? And supply chains go right back to the dawn of civilization.
Mm.
People were trading obsidian to make really, really sharp knives across the Middle East. at least 7,000 years ago. Mm. Trading networks have always been there.
Yeah.
And because they're about strangers doing deals, they have to have sort of these impersonal kind of mechanisms that are not what you have to do if you're inside a family or whatever. So, so that's the kind of system two, and I call that the exchange modality. It's also about fairness and justice and balance and stuff like that. Then there is the what I call the conditioned hierarchy modality, which is the one that can go horribly wrong because it's about people complying with social power.
Mm.
So there is a power structure. It corresponds to the relationship between the system three cohesion doing a resource bargain with the operations people saying, you're not going to have enough money to pay your rent unless you turn up and follow your contract here because you're going to get fired. But that turns into a power thing
Mm.
that can get quite ugly. And also, it builds a sort of status hierarchy where people at the top of the tree have got social prestige. Everybody goes, oh, oh, yes, listen to him, even when they're talking practically stupid nonsense.
Yeah.
But once you've got social power, you can talk all sorts of crazy stuff, and everybody listens to you and snaps it all up and buys your book. So there's that social power aspect. I call that conditioned hierarchies, where they are a power structure which tends to hypnotize people into compliance. But it feels very real to them because it's the domain in which their hopes and fears are very visible. And it's why people listen to chat show hosts. You look at it and go, well, why is anybody listening to, I don't know, Gwyneth Paltrow about anything when she's just a professional person whose job it is to pretend to be somebody she isn't. She's an actor or actress or whatever.
Mm. Mm.
And yet everybody goes, oh my God, she's, all that kind of stuff. Well, why? I mean,
Yeah.
why does she have anything worth listening to any more than you do, Sajni? I mean, like, what's going on?
Mm. Mm.
Because social status is a very mysterious, powerful thing.
Yeah.
The last one is what I call learning network modality, which I kind of hope we're in at the moment. Because the difference between the conditioned hierarchy power thing, where everybody listens to the people with status, even when they're frankly talking nonsense, and their status doesn't get affected by the fact that the things they say turn out to be completely wrong. I mean, it doesn't make any difference. They're still there selling books and everybody loves them. Um, the difference is that in there's a learning methodology. You've asked me to answer some questions, and apologies if it's taken me too long.
Absolutely
But,
not.
but while I'm talking to you to explain something you've asked me about, you have to kind of subordinate yourself temporarily and listen to me rambling on in order to get it, because you're not going to
Mm.
learn it from me if you won't listen. Yeah?
Yeah.
But once you've got it, you end up on the same status level as I do. So it's dynamic. It's not a fixed status hierarchy. It's fluid because it flows depending on who's got knowledge.
Mm.
And as that knowledge gets distributed, the relationship is no longer I boss you around and tell you because I know more than you do. Eventually, you're going to learn more about this than I do. At which point, I need to shut up and listen to you. And that's what I call learning network modality. And it's quite simple. It's things like that ratio club. It's like informal, like if you think about Lloyd's Insurance, this huge thing that's got a giant building in the city of London. It was originally a coffee shop in 17th century London where people could go and get a cup of coffee. And there was a blackboard that said, oh, yeah, there's a ship coming in. That's the name of the ship. It will arrive at such and such a time. This is what cargo is on board.
Wow.
You might be an investor in the venture, that you might have invested in that ship. So you're going to come to that coffee shop. But there's no formal structure to it. It's
Yeah.
entirely informal, but it's where you go to learn. about shipping, and it ends up inventing insurance. The global shipping insurance becomes Lloyd's Shipping Register, and Lloyd's, this massive organization starts out as just one of these funny little learning networks that's completely informal.
Yeah.
And actually, London in the 17th century was incredibly good at these learning networks. It's the secret of its ability to invent things very, very fast and to out-invent other people, such as their eternal enemies, the French, that they fought all these wars against. And if you look at people like Napoleon, when he was the emperor of France, and England and France fought each other for, I think it was about a total of 23 years. It was a 23-year war between France after the Revolution and then Napoleon leading up. And it didn't end until 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo.
Mm.
And it was a whole generation of war. It was absolutely horrific.
Yeah.
The French couldn't keep up with this inventiveness thing because Napoleon was paranoid about anybody um, meeting up in an informal environment because he saw it as being a political threat. So he had secret
Yeah.
police spying on them.
Right.
And if they stepped out of line, they would end up in prison. So he was running a police state. And therefore, the rate at which learning could take place and things could be invented, he actually, without realizing it, totally undermined all that stuff, which enabled the British, who were far less powerful when they started out, to outwit the French and to defeat Napoleon, and end up burning the British Empire. But it is these learning networks which are very, very strange because they're not formalized, they're spontaneous, and they pop up because people get interested in things, and then they disappear and another one pops up. And that's the nature of the dynamism of them. And they're quite fluid.
Yeah. I mean,
People in normal life don't really understand them very well.
yeah.
So that's it. Those are the five modalities. My proposition is that if you understand how to operate those clearly and you don't get mixed up with each other, you can create much more effective organizations that are dynamic and fluid and evolutionary, and in the end can outperform anything else and give us the time to go off and do more interesting things than slaving away when we can probably figure out how to get an AI to do it or whatever.
Yeah. It's like how much time is wasted in meetings that are probably
It's
meaningless
horrific.
and not needed. Coming back to something that you said, though, this conditioned hierarchy, it can cause all sorts of problems. And then actually relating that to, when there is this learning network and it's genuinely working, you can actually distribute the power quite effectively. There's obviously kind of human nature that comes into that, but what in your experience has been the relationship between being able to shift between the two modes with ease or
Well, again,
grace?
different people have got different personalities, and it tends to be the fact that people who love the learning network modality, they tend to be early adopters. The people that spot something and go off down that track faster than other people do, but they often don't understand how to operate in the conditioned hierarchy modality. And if you want to be a reputable member of a community, you have to know how to conduct yourself appropriately in one of those. So if I want to go and talk to people in the city of London, which I do, it's sort of like, uh, connections with finance in the city of London. If I want to speak to them, I have to speak to them in their language. Otherwise, they just think I'm some kind of a freak and they're not even going to let me through the door. So if I have to put on a business suit and look kind of like an old guy, because I am an old guy, and speak their language and listen to them and communicate in their language, I have to do that if I want to change the way they're working. So if I come along and go, "Oh, you're just a bunch of stupid old farts and you're a bunch of idiots," they're not going to learn anything from me. Um, and the other thing is that people love being in a properly functioning conditioned hierarchy because it's where, when it's working well and it's properly connected to its environment, it's where we get our sort of social satisfactions and the sense of the work is flowing and everything works and everything's in the right place and we produce and everybody loves us because the customers get a great service. So it's not to be demonized
Mm.
when it's properly structurally coupled to the environment. It's how you deliver stuff. So if you stay in the learning network modality all the time, you don't get anything delivered in the work. Yeah. So you have to know how to learn what you need to learn and then bring it into those conditioned hierarchies in a manner that enables them to become more functional, to keep on keeping on and delivering the good.
Mm. Mm.
Uh, so a lot of the work we do in context career consulting is about helping people because what the problem is with the conditional hierarchy thing is when it starts, it's great and everybody wants to be in it, but then the environment starts to change. And the temptation of the people with high social status is to go, oh, it used to work. It
Mm.
doesn't work anymore. It must be your fault. You're not working hard enough. Do what you That's not because oh the environment's changed. We need to rethink what we're doing. But this used to work really well. It's not working anymore. It's because you're a bunch of lazy so and so's. You're not doing the work. Do
Yeah.
more. Work harder. And if you don't, we'll fire you. And of course, they haven't understood that they're not structurally coupled to an environment where they're delivering anything anymore. They becoming oppressive,
Yeah.
and actually people end up hating them and not wanting to work for them anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, in a stable environment, those things don't show up. They can not show up for 1,000 years. It's only when the environment starts to change faster and faster and faster that those social status hierarchies become oppressive to people. So
Yeah.
none of this is about that one's a good one and that one's a bad one. It's like, hey, if you're trying to deliver stuff and you understand what needs to be delivered, you need to build a structure with a governance structure where people are paying attention to what they need to do and they can turn their hand on, they get work satisfaction and go home knowing they've done a good job and that customers love them and all that kind of stuff. That's good while it's properly connected up. It only becomes oppressive when the environment has changed so it no longer is the appropriate thing to do.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So this is the story of the rise and fall of civilization, is that any civilization gets founded by brilliant guardians who are charismatic and people want to participate in what they do. Um, but over a period of time, that turns into a power structure, one of these conditioned hierarchies. Then it starts to get oppressive.
Yeah.
A lot of people who have anthropologists and people like that, like David Graeber, you may know about David Graeber's work on. He was an anthropologist who wrote Debt the First 5,000 Years, which is an amazing book about the history of money. It's absolutely fantastic, one of the best works in it. But he was an anarchist, and anarchists don't understand the difference between the legitimate guardianship modality
Yeah.
of come and join what we're doing because you're going to love it. And people go, yeah, we do love it. And how that turns into one of these oppressive power structures. He couldn't tell the one from the other. A lot of people can't actually. They just
Mm.
think these power structures are horrible. Just get rid of them. We don't need it. And you go, "Oh, nothing will work because most of what we learn when we're growing up, we're learning from just becoming part of a conditioned hierarchy that's already there. Like
Yeah.
how else do we speak our first language? We pick it out from the people around us that are already speaking it.
Yeah. And no, there's a
Nobody teaches
concept
it.
in
Yeah,
Tantra, which is about the middle pathway. This is not about right versus left.
yeah, exactly.
This is not about chaos versus structure. This
No,
is really about balance and finding,
Yes,
agile doesn't work without the guardrails.
correct.
We need to really masculine and feminine. There's no battle between the two. It's about finding that middle pathway between.
And that's the point is that I hope that the combination of thinking through this viable systems approach and the moral modalities framework gives people a framework for thinking that is very, very lightweight. It has a lot of explanatory power across a lot of domains that people otherwise think are separate from each other when they are. And it's not intended to be um, something you can believe. You're not supposed to become a convert to it. We are interested in helping people to operate it to become more effective, and that isn't the same thing as, oh, I'm a believer in Stafford Beale was a great guru and I love his, or, yeah, we're not interested in becoming kind of authority figures to anybody. We're
Yeah.
interested in saying, here's a set of tools. Some of these tools are conceptual tools. They're the most effective ones we know. If you're interested in them, we can teach them to you really, really fast, like a day
Mm.
to get your feet on the starting line. But to practice it effectively could take quite a long time. But actually, if you start to see these things, and once you start seeing them, they become really obvious, and you go, "Why couldn't I see that before? It's so obvious and it's so simple."
What's I have one like final question for you, I guess. What's one really simple, beautiful example of the application of this that you've come across?
Well, good heavens! Uh, I could talk. We have a client that we started working with. Um, actually, only about 6 months ago, and they're a startup, and they're a really interesting startup. I don't want to say too much about it because they're just about to do a big launch, and it's all undercover at the moment. I mean, literally within days. So I can't really. But it's basically about how to enable people to stop buying those plastic bags full of horrible tasting salad that you get in supermarkets, which get thrown away. Because instead of buying a bag of salad, which is quite expensive, and ending up it goes off in your fridge because when you throw it away, it's a way of growing healthy salad and stuff in your house, in your kitchen. So you grow it yourself and it tastes fantastic because it's completely fresh.
Yeah.
Now, we've just literally, so what we found is when we made contact with these people, they, they'd struggled to get their pre-seed funding round. They tried twice over 3 years and failed. They just could not get the funding. And I think, and now they are getting it. And in fact, to be honest, I'm an anchor investor because I love it so much. So I am actually one of the investors. So we
Disclaimer.
don't just do consultancy. If we really like the proposition, I will invest in it because I want to get some assets into things that I care about from sort of abstract financial system that's probably a bit flaky to things that are doing interesting stuff in the world. And literally, they couldn't get things off the ground, and they were very frustrated when we met because they weren't feeling like, why can't we get this funding round off the ground? And what were able to show them was that they'd thought of the idea that they needed the 1.3 million pound funding, then they could build a community, right?
Mm.
And we said, no, no, you're not getting this. The people who will give you that funding round are the core of your community, and you've not understood that you've got such a great story here. If you were telling it properly, the investors would be biting your hand off. But you're not communicating this story in such a way that the investors want to be in the story.
Mm.
And now, they once they got that, they went, "Oh my God, why couldn't we see that before?" So to a large extent, what we do for people is to ask them powerful questions, so they go, "Oh yeah." Oh, of course. We've just been missing the point. We didn't get the fact that the funding is also the foundation of our community. We thought of it as give us some money, then we built the thing. And it's like really, really simple. And yet they just couldn't see that.
On that note, thank you so much for joining the conversation today. The irony is that we didn't even touch on equal care co-op, which is
But we didn't get
exactly
around to it, you're right. But hey,
so that could be part two, I guess.
it could be indeed, yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. What did you think?
Well, the man knows his stuff, that's for sure. And he also, the thing that stood out to me most, and I wrote down, is like there's so much knowledge and so much we know about how humans work and how humans work in an organization, yet we don't do it. That's like
Yeah.
very clearly. He tells about the project that he does in 1996, trying to, and then afterwards doing conferences and talks about the project. People walking out, and that's where basically the challenge is for our yeah, for people that want to see that change in leadership and see where
Yeah.
um, yeah, it's just it's a big challenge, and it's interesting to see him. He knows all the stuff and he has the connections, yet still it's very hard to get through to people because the incentives are just not aligned properly here, I guess.
Yeah, I think you're nailing a few really key points there. It's like, yeah, the incentivization is towards like maximization of profit, and that sometimes doesn't take into account the human element, and actually, human evolution doesn't really fit into the current system sometimes. Yeah, my takeaways from listening to him was like, gosh, he talks. I love this analogy where he uses this like fountain pen, and I'm just like, gosh, what a fountain of knowledge is within Trevor. And one of the things I love about spending time with him is he's this like extremely techie guy, but he also has this degree in theology and understanding of human nature. And I think that unique blend of both is actually exactly what the world needs right now. I've been reading
Yeah.
some like Ian McGilchrist recently, and he talks about the master and his emissary and this kind of this right and left brain thinking, or starting to use creative thinking not as the slave of the more logical side, but actually your creative side is or your perceptive side is able to see, understand what's going on, and that actually is what needs to be given more attention and more respect. And so I love how he's able to like really do that. And his ability to kind of use storytelling to share these really complex ideas, um, it's such a it's so wonderful. Um,
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
other
He really takes you back to the old days and like makes you like
yeah,
warm and fuzzy for the 90s and the 60s and the
yeah.
70s. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting.
And I love how he talks about how he got to this place where he was no longer needing to support his family financially because he got to a place of financial stability, and then he had almost what he describes, it sounds to me like it was a bit of a fallow period where he could sit back and understand and recognize the patterns within his career. And then Steve Jobs talks about this a lot as well, and how during those fallow periods is when that real like creativity can happen. And I just feel like it's in modern life, often really great thinkers don't get a chance to have those periods of stillness and periods of quiet, where, we can tap into intuition, into being, rather than doing all the time.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and not even like great thinkers. Like everyone should have like a
Everyone.
day a month to just be on paid leave to think about everything that they're doing, sitting down with a notebook and just yeah, just do nothing and
Yeah.
feel what's going
Yeah.
on. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
100%. And we're going to go back to him and ask him about his experience of setting up a cooperative model and what he learned from that as well. So he set up the equal care. Sorry, he didn't set up he was a part of the team, within the equal care co-op. And I think, just to go back to what you said though, yeah, he uses these like really simple words to explain really complex ideas. And even his model for understanding social dynamics, his moral modalities model, is one of those things that you can understand it just looking at it, and then you just go deeper and deeper into it, and it's got these really profound implications and use cases. And I think we're just at the beginning of really being able to use that within organizations. Also, just one final point around
Yeah.
I love how he talks about this ratio club, and there's like this geek in me that's like, I want to be in the ratio club, not the Athenian club or whatever that is. So it's like, yeah, I just love like the geekiness of all of it as well. It's really
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah. He was working with computers before anyone was seeing any value in it. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Exactly.
He was
Yeah,
very in the
yeah, yeah.
he probably still is very much at the forefront of technology and organizational development.
See you for the next takeaways for episode 2.